Welcome to the Aurora Public Library District's The Cemeteries of Aurora, Part 2, the Southeast Side. Today's segment will focus on the burial grounds located south of New York Street and east of the Fox River. Without any further ado, let's take a fond look at Mount Olivet and Spring Lake cemeteries. Mount Olivet is easily one of the most beautiful and best maintained graveyards in the city. It is located on the southeast corner of Ashland and Lincoln Avenues and lies directly across the street from Spring Lake. Plans to open a new cemetery began to appear in 1886. According to an article from the March 13th Beacon of that year, some citizens objected to having another graveyard located east of Spring Lake. Most of their protests centered on keeping the land for other purposes. The Beacon argued that part of the grounds were low-lying and even swampy, and few people would ever wish to build there, even if it was otherwise, as it would confront Spring Lake Cemetery. The newspaper predicted that a cemetery would be large enough for both the German and Catholic societies for a century to come. May 28, 1887, it was announced that Mount Olivet would be consecrated on June 5th by Archbishop Theon of Chicago. However, the day before the ceremony, it was reported that he would not be available. Even so, it was anticipated that many would attend the opening anyway. Despite the number of other Catholic burial grounds in Aurora, Mount Olivet was not tied to a specific congregation and was open to any Catholic interments. Given its greater size and natural beauty of the site, it soon became a very popular resting place for many of Aurora's Catholic citizens. One of the most prominent people buried at Mount Olivet is Frank Thielen. His life reads like a true Horatio Alger story. One of 5 children and orphaned when only 5 years old, Thielen was always a hard worker. He started out selling newspapers. Later, he drove a laundry truck at $10 per week after leaving school. Thielen managed to save enough money to open a restaurant in which he served as cook and waiter. His next venture was opening the Bijou Theater, a 5-cent movie house. The Nickelodeon was so successful, he moved to larger quarters renamed the Star. This was the beginning of an empire that would encompass the Fox, Strand, and Rialto theaters here in Aurora, the Crocker and Grove theaters in Elgin, the Orpheum, Princess, and Crystal theaters in Joliet, the Majestic Theater in Bloomington, the Orpheum in Galesburg, the Lincoln Square Movie House in Springfield, and the Midway Theater in Rockford. He also had an interest in Aurora's Paramount. When Thielen sold these holdings later, they went for $1 million. In addition, he was instrumental in the creation of Exposition Park and served as president of the Central States Fair Association. He was director of the Aurora Trust and Savings Bank, and Thielen was one of the founders of Aurora's Country Club. Mount Olivet also contains the gravesites of the Gosselin family, hoteliers extraordinaires, who owned both the Aurora and Leland hotels. The family sold off their interests in the late 1970s. The Gosselins erected one of the most elaborate markers in the cemetery, a classical Greek colonnade with the family name prominently carved across the top. Another notable is Frank Haney. Haney was a graduate of East Aurora High School who later went pro after playing on Indiana University's football team. His career lasted from 1923 to 1930 with stints on the Chicago Bears and the Green Bay Packers. Haney earned the dubious distinction of being the first NFL player ever ejected from a game when he got into a punching match with Tilly Voss of the Packers. My favorite monument at Mount Olivet is dedicated to the Garvey family. None of my visits to the cemetery is complete without taking another photograph of the angel perched on top. Now on to other views of this fine cemetery. Moving right along, we cross the street and enter Spring Lake Cemetery. Spring Lake is located on the east side of Broadway, Route 25, between Sims and Ashland. Comprising 45 acres, this cemetery was established around the close of the Civil War. Why Spring Lake? If you visit today, you'll note a deep hollow passing through the middle of the grounds. This was originally planned as a man-made lake that would be fed by natural springs, and after some delay, the work was completed to make this a reality. It is my understanding that the resulting lake was once popular with ice skaters. However, the land was later drained to provide more space for burials. As Root Street Cemetery ran out of space, citizens of Aurora began agitating for a larger graveyard in 1864. Two editorials appeared in the Aurora Beacon. One began by asking, "How about that long-needed and oft-promised cemetery? Are we to have one? Or are we to continue to bury our friends in the old and unbeautified grounds with the certainty that they must be removed?" This letter, signed by Improvement, pointed out that people seemed to be waiting for some action from the city council who had neither the power, inclination, or enterprise enough to move on this matter. 2 weeks later came another letter to the Beacon which noted, "It is very strange that the businessmen of the East Division have not made a move along ere this to attain the desired result." This author pointed out that the aldermen were not in favor of establishing a new cemetery, and that the city funds for some time would be devoted to the construction of the old city hall. The writer then went on to state that the issue was strictly one concerning the citizens of the east side of the Fox River, and thus could not count on much support from those on the opposite bank. The Aurora Cemetery Association was later organized to move toward the establishment of a new burial ground. Their act of incorporation was approved in February 1865, and a complete publication of the charter appeared in the Aurora Beacon July 21, 1866. A November 16, 1865 article announced that 31 acres of the Bloss Farm had been purchased for a new cemetery at a cost of $110 per acre. It is a beautiful location and capable of being arranged to do credit to our city. 1 week later, the association announced that they had hired a landscape gardener to begin improvements on the land. It will be the especial effort of the present officers and board to make their premises ornamental and honorable to our growing and beautiful city. By the summer of 1866, work commenced to convert the farmland to its new purpose. One proposed effort was digging a large bed for the natural spring situated there to form an ornamental lake that would cover 4 to 5 acres of the site. This, however, as I noted before, did not take place for some years until all of the association's debts had been paid. One factor often cited in these early accounts about the cemetery was Article 12 in the Charter of Incorporation. This stated that after all of the expenses for purchase of land and costs of improvements were covered, money raised by the sale of lots would be invested in a maintenance fund. There can be no doubt but the cemetery will be exclusively for the public benefit, and we advise the public to interest themselves early and help make the cemetery one of the finest in Illinois. The article also stated, "We understand that very many of our citizens who have buried their friends in the old ground contemplate removing them here as soon as the grounds are in readiness." The remains of the George F. Buck family were among the early exodus from Root Street. Given the natural beauty of the site, Spring Lake became very popular almost immediately. The original plans were that Colonel Silas Miller would be the first laid to rest there. A description of his monument during its creation provided the dimensions of the various parts and concluded, "The whole is of the finest Vermont marble, and the work upon it pronounced superior to anything of the kind ever executed in this part of the country." This testimonial of respect to the brave and noble name it bears is the gift mainly of the officers and men composing the 36th Regiment, Illinois Volunteers, of which Colonel Miller was in command at the time of his death. Fate had other plans, though, and Miller did not become the first interment because before his monument was finished, William West was the first person buried at the site. Miller would follow 2 months later. By May 1872, it was noted that we were a little startled to notice how rapidly this city of the dead is becoming populated. It seems but yesterday since this rural spot was inaugurated, yet the marble slabs and granite columns loom up with painful frequency. The annual report presented February 1, 1894 by the Association President E.R. Allen indicated that 2,340 burials had taken place by then. He went on to state that several reinterments from other cemeteries occurred in that last calendar year. Many of the most prominent civic and business leaders of Aurora selected Spring Lake for their final resting place over the course of the next several decades. Graves here include those for B.F. Fridley. Fridley was Kane County's first sheriff and state's attorney. Aurora's founding family members, the McCartys, have a fine monument here, as does utilities magnate, former U.S. House of Representative from the 11th District, and Copley Press founder, Colonel Ira Clifton Copley. One of the finest tombstones is dedicated to Reverend J.C. Stoughton, local Methodist minister and temperance lecturer. We also see the gravesite of George Corot. Corot was the first principal of Clark, later Jennings Seminary, and manager of the Aurora Silver Plate Company. As a side note, Corot is widely believed to be the model for Mark Twain's professor in The Innocents Abroad. The two met while passengers on the Quaker City steamship bound for Europe in 1867. Also located at Spring Lake are the graves of Emma Mabella Baker and her husband George Broderick. For those who didn't catch the Aurora Public Library District's January 9th program on these two, they were in national touring companies performing in several Gilbert and Sullivan operettas during the late 19th century. And Baker appeared in a handful of early 20th century Broadway productions. In addition, Broderick, her husband, was an early recording artist, and both were cast in the first pirated American production of The Mikado in 1885. The veterans of several wars have their final resting place here. Frederick Vaughan is the earliest of these. Vaughan served during the Revolutionary War and died in 1845. His remains were removed from Root Street Cemetery in 1914. His son, also at Spring Lake, was a veteran of the War of 1812. Two other soldiers fought in the Mexican War. 297 served in the Civil War. 25 were part of the Spanish-American War. 85 soldiers were in World War I, and another 21 served in World War II, buried there as of May 1960. Besides Colonel Silas Miller, as noted before, the breveted Brigadier General Nicholas Grissel, commander of the 36th Illinois Regiment during the Civil War, is buried nearby. An exemplary drill master, Grissel was awarded a silver pistol for having the best drilled regiment in the Army. Across the cemetery on the east side lie the remains of Dr. Abner Hard, who served as a surgeon for the 8th Illinois Cavalry. In fine, Spring Lake is truly a great time capsule of the people who left their mark on Aurora history. If you're interested in the past, this is a great introduction to decades of the lives that made Aurora what it is today. What follows are a variety of slides taken in the past few years at Spring Lake Cemetery.